We're all here to talk about an awful thing, but for most of us, it's something that we've studied. It's something, certainly as a clinician, I've seen in patients. Fortunately, none of my patients died of it. But for the families that have experienced this in particular, I think it's extraordinary that they would come out and expend the kind of energy that they do trying to protect other people from this happening to them. So what I want to do today is give you a historical perspective for this, because a lot of people thought that the warnings that came out in 2004 kind of came out of the blue, and they didn't at all, and I really think it's very important for the media to understand that. I'm going to kind of fly through a lot of information, and we do have a question and answer period afterwards if you want to go over some specifics more. I personally am a moderate in this debate and want to say that up front. I prescribe antidepressants all the time, but I have been a critic of them being overprescribed and of patients not being warned adequately of side effects. And I think one of the most important functions that I serve in coming here today, quite apart from all the statistics and the 15-year history, is to say that I've personally witnessed this side effect in patients, and many, many of my colleagues have. And once you've seen it firsthand and you can distinguish it from the suicidality of depression, nobody can talk you out of it, including the FDA with fancy statistics. I want to focus, starting out, on Dr. Lofgren's overview for tomorrow's meeting, which I'm sure that all of you have been looking at, and you'll see that he very explicitly says that this is a phenomena that has been under discussion for decades. He actually quotes a 1960 textbook saying that antidepressants early in treatment appear to increase the risk of suicide. Up until fairly recently, up until the introduction of Prozac and the SSRIs, that was what was thought of as re-energizing depressed patients to act on suicidal urges that they already have. It was called the rollback phenomenon. It was that well established. And the big divide here was 1990, right after Prozac had been introduced, and two Harvard psychiatrists and many, many others. I have a long list here of other people who published on the same subject at the time, but Teicher and Cole really got a lot of attention because they were both at Harvard, they were both drug researchers, they'd actually done research for Lilly on Prozac, and they published a series of 6 patients in which they said that they had become obsessively preoccupied with suicide, and it appeared that the drug induced this. And that's key for you to understand, the idea that a drug could induce it as opposed to just energize somebody who already has suicidal thoughts. And as you heard about Woody's case, where his original diagnosis was insomnia, we have seen patients who were put on these drugs for headaches, for nail biting, for obsessive compulsive disorder, for depression without suicidality, who become acutely suicidal, especially in the early weeks of treatment or any time that the dose is changed. After Teicher and Cole's article, this exploded in the media in 1990. If you think there's been a lot of attention to this issue in 2004 and 2005, 2006, it's nothing like the attention that there was to it in 1990 and 91. And that's what I want you to really understand. The FDA held a hearing on September 20th, 1991, just like the hearings they held in 2004 and will hold tomorrow. There's a very long history to this. Going back to Dr. Lofgren's overview, you'll see that he says that the 1991 hearing found no clear evidence of an increased risk from antidepressants and that the committee did not recommend any warnings. Well, what Dr. Lofgren fails to tell you in his overview for tomorrow is that 5 of the 9 committee members in 1990 had such severe conflicts of interest, close ties to the pharmaceutical industry, that the FDA had to waive its own standards for conflicts of interest. That despite that, 3 of the 9 members, a third of the committee, voted for warnings back in 1991, that Teicher and Cole were not scheduled to speak to the committee, whereas 4 Eli Lilly doctors were, and that there were repeated comments, and I would encourage any of you journalists who are particularly interested in this subject to get the transcript of that 1991 hearing, and you'll see them over and over again, and this is just a series of quotes saying how crude the data was, how coarse the instruments were, and how much there was a need for more research. One of the things that the FDA repeatedly leaves out is what I would call the efficacy factor, which means that if you take a large population of patients and a significant number of them feel better and become less suicidal, okay, when you take the aggregate data, when you net that out, it's going to cover up a smaller number of patients becoming suicidal who never would have before. So it's a beneficial effect to a larger number of patients that masks a negative effect to a smaller number of patients. And we'll see how critical that is and still is today. Eli Lilly, back in 1991, and these are internal company documents that are now in the public record and would be readily available to you, agreed with the FDA to do a study, very different. All these studies we're looking at were studying depression and whether or not the drugs worked or other indications. The measures for suicidality were very crude and insensitive. You could do a study specifically looking at suicidality, treatment-emergent suicidality. That still hasn't been done, despite the fact that it was recognized in 1991 that there was a need for that. Lilly agreed to do it. Lilly developed more sensitive scales for assessing suicidality. They planned to share the scales with other companies that were testing SSRIs in the pipeline. They consulted over 200 experts to develop the protocol for the study. And after the hearing passed, they never did it. FDA didn't hold them to do it. FDA didn't get the companies who were studying other SSRIs to use the scales. Now, despite that, in about 1992, 93, 94, you see some individual researchers continuing to look into this side effect despite the kind of papering over it in 1991. And what you see them doing is zeroing in on a side effect called akathisia, which is the side effect that Woody and so many other patients have gotten. It's a form of severe agitation that there's a long literature of it making people suicidal going back to the 60s and 70s with an earlier class of drugs. And you see early papers as early as 1989 talking about akathisia with SSRIs. Here's a study done at Harvard of people who'd made suicide attempts at Prozac, given the Prozac again. They all developed akathisia. They all said it was that and not their underlying conditions that had caused it. Here's a study at UCLA. Here's a study at Columbia. All of this ignored by the FDA.